Welcome back to the deep dive, where we like to really get into the nitty-gritty of, well, everyday stuff.
Yeah.
Today we're thinking about language learning. Well, not exactly learning it ourselves, but looking at how it's taught and what that can tell us about culture.
That's kind of like putting language itself under the microscope, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Our source material is an episode from this podcast called Podcast for Professionals. It's all about like practical English for work and social situations and all that. But we're going to go deeper than just vocab lists, right? We want to see how language like reflects culture in these subtle ways.
Yeah, sometimes those basic phrases can actually be super revealing about what a culture values, what they just like assume.
Okay, so let's dive in. The episode starts with this classic scenario, a crowded train in Shanghai. Someone wants to sit, so they ask, "Excuse me, is the seat taken?" Now, on the surface, that just seems like, a simple question.
Yeah. But even in a simple interaction like that, there's a ton of cultural context.
Yeah.
Some cultures, starting a conversation on public transport, it's just like not done.
Yeah.
Super awkward. But in other cultures, it's completely normal, expected even.
Oh, that's interesting. So it kind of shows how comfortable people are just like talking to strangers, right?
Yeah.
Out in public.
Exactly. And the response in the podcast, no, please, feel free. That's also interesting. Feel free. It's meant to be polite, welcoming, but it can be weird if you use it too much.
Right. Like if someone keeps saying, feel free to have another cookie, feel free, feel free. It's like, okay, are you just trying to get rid of me?
Yeah, exactly. It's tricky. Like feel free can be great for building that connection, and encouraging people to like participate. But if it's all the time, it loses its meaning.
So how would you use feel free in a way that sounds, natural, not forced?
Okay, so instead of feel free to ask any questions, which sounds a bit stiff, right?
Hmm.
You could say, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Same message, but warmer, more like a real conversation.
I like that. Good tip. I'm going to try to be more aware of that myself. Okay, moving on. The podcast then goes into a conversation between the two hosts, and one says, yes, I do work in Shanghai. And the other replies, how about you? I've seen that phrase trip up like a lot of English learners.
Yeah, people mix it up with how was it, like asking about an experience.
Yeah.
But here, how about you? It's just keeping the conversation going. It's like inviting the other person to share, right? Like, what about you? Do you work in Shanghai too?
Right. So it's about like finding common ground, keeping
Exactly.
things flowing. I get how that could be confusing.
Totally. And the podcast gives this great example. Imagine you say, I'd like a hamburger and fries. How about you? You're not asking how their last meal was. You want to know what they want now.
Okay, that makes sense. It's all about context, picking up on those little cues.
Exactly. Speaking of cues, later on, one of the speakers is like gushing about Shanghai, and the other person says, you can say that again.
Now, that one I've definitely heard before, but honestly, I never really thought about what it truly means.
Like, yeah, it seems like just agreeing, right?
Mhm.
But it's stronger than that. It's like, I totally agree, 100%. It's like adding, 5 exclamation points to what you're saying.
So it's not just agreeing, it's like showing you're really excited about it too.
Exactly. And that's where your tone of voice comes in. If you say, you can say that again, all flat, it'll sound sarcastic, maybe even mean. But if you say it with energy, it shows like real enthusiasm.
Oh, that reminds me of this time when I completely messed that phrase up. I was in a meeting and someone was complaining about how long it was taking. So I was trying to be all, cool and casual and said, you can say that again. And the whole room just went silent. Everyone was staring at me like I had, 3 heads.
I can imagine. Repeating their complaint back to them, probably not what they wanted.
No, not at all. I learned that day, context and tone are everything with a phrase like that.
Right. It's a perfect example of how even simple phrases can have all this hidden meaning, right? And how important it is to like really get those nuances.
Speaking of hidden meaning, the next phrase that caught my ear was originally. One of the podcast speakers says, I'm from Kansas, originally.
Originally. It's such a small word,
Yeah.
but it's got so much packed into it. Like it's about belonging, about where you come from, even if you don't live there anymore.
I've always thought it's interesting how much people identify with their hometown, Even
Yeah.
if they haven't been there in forever, it's like a part of them stays connected to that place.
It's like saying, this is my foundation, a piece of who I am. And I think that resonates with a lot of people, especially now when everyone's moving around so much.
It's like holding on to your past, acknowledging where you started.
Yeah, and I think it's also a way to connect with people who come from the same place, even if you've never met them before.
Like an instant connection, right? Something you share without even needing to say it. And speaking of saying things, the American guy in the podcast, he describes Kansas as a much quieter and more peaceful place than here, that's for sure. That phrase, that's for sure, it's like just adding emphasis, right?
It is, but it's also what linguists call a discourse marker. It's like a word or phrase that doesn't change the actual meaning, but tells you how the speaker feels about it.
So in this case, that's for sure, is like adding this layer of like total certainty. He's really convinced.
Exactly. It's like saying, this isn't just a fact, I'm really hammering it home.
And isn't it cool how these little additions to our sentences can totally change how they come across?
Totally. They show how we connect, how we express ourselves beyond just the dictionary definition.
Okay, I'm seeing now how even simple phrases can tell us a lot about our culture and all those unspoken rules of, how to talk to each other. But things get really interesting when the podcast gets into some potentially awkward stuff, like the do's and don'ts of small talk in America.
Yeah, this is where knowing the culture is super important, right? What's a normal question in one place could be like a huge no-no somewhere else.
It's like those invisible tripwires you don't see until it's too late.
Exactly. And the podcast gives some classic examples. In America, you generally don't ask about someone's salary, their religion, or how much their stuff costs.
Really? I gotta say, that's surprising. I get the salary thing, but religion, that seems like a pretty normal topic in a lot of places.
Yeah, but in America, it's seen as very personal, private. Bringing it up casually can feel intrusive, disrespectful even.
So why is that? Why is religion such a sensitive topic there?
Well, there's a few reasons, I think. First, America's got a ton of different religions. It can be really tricky to navigate,
Yeah, I see what you mean, like walking on eggshells.
Exactly. And second, there's this big emphasis on individual freedom and privacy in America. People are just like hesitant to talk about personal beliefs, anything that could cause conflict.
So it's not about religion itself, but about respecting boundaries, avoiding anything controversial.
Exactly. Small talk's about making people feel comfortable, not putting them on the spot or starting an argument.
Okay, I get that. But what if you're not from America? How do you deal with these differences?
Just be mindful, pay attention, see how people talk to each other, what they talk about, what they avoid, and don't be afraid to ask if you're not sure about something. It's way better to clarify than to, accidentally offend someone.
Good advice. So what other conversational, danger zones should we watch out for when it comes to American small talk?
Well, keep in mind that Americans tend to be very future-focused. They'd rather talk about plans, what they want to do, than dwell on the past.
So if I ask about their childhood or family history, it might not be as interesting as, say, talking about their next vacation or their career goals.
Yeah, exactly. It's not that they don't care about their past. It's just their energy's focused on what's next.
I see. It's a subtle difference, but it could change the whole vibe of a conversation.
Totally. And another thing is, Americans can be pretty individualistic. They value independence, achievement, which can seem competitive sometimes.
So, bragging about your accomplishments might be okay in America, but not in cultures that are more about humility.
Right. It's not that they're arrogant. It's more that they're taught to, celebrate their successes.
Okay, I'm starting to grasp these little cultural things. But how does this all play out in, real-life conversations?
Well, say you're at a party. You might hear Americans talking about their jobs, hobbies, trips they've taken. They like to share.
And would it be rude to interrupt them or switch topics?
Depends. But usually, yeah, interrupting is considered bad manners. Best to wait for a pause before jumping in.
Okay, makes sense. So what are some safe things to talk about if you're trying to make small talk with an American?
You can't go wrong with weather, current events, sports, movies, books, stuff that's pretty neutral, not likely to cause any drama.
What about asking about their family? Is that all right?
It can be, but be careful. A simple, how's your family, is fine, but don't get into their marital status, kids, or their relationship with their parents. Keep it light.
Got it. Respect boundaries, keep it light.
Exactly. Small talk's like a dance,
Yeah.
Finding a rhythm, connecting, but without stepping on anyone's toes.
I like that. So what have we learned about the hidden world of American small talk?
It's more than just chit-chat, right? It's this whole system of cultural rules, a lot of them unspoken.
Yeah, and even the simplest phrases can say so much about a culture, what they value.
For sure. And as we keep going with this language podcast, we'll find even more fascinating stuff about how language shapes how we see the world.
Stay tuned, everyone, because things are about to get really interesting. Welcome back to the deep dive. We're still digging into the world of language learning.
But as we've seen, it's really about more than just learning words and grammar.
Right. We're like peeling back the layers and seeing how culture really shapes the way we talk.
Yeah, it's like language is this window into like how people think, what they believe.
Okay, so let's get back to that episode of Podcast for Professionals. I want to see
Yeah.
what other interesting stuff we can find.
You know, one phrase that really stuck with me was originally, like
Yeah.
when that guy said, "I'm from Kansas originally." Simple, but it kind of hints at something deeper,
Yeah.
about like identity.
You know, it's funny you should mention that. I've moved around a bit myself, and I always notice people ask, where are you from originally? Like they want to know the real me,
Yeah.
where I really belong.
That's so true. It's like language has this power to like tie us to a specific place, a specific time. Originally acknowledges that our past shapes who we are, even if we've moved on, experienced new things.
Like saying, this is where my story started. And I think a lot of people feel that, especially now when the world's so, global and everyone's moving around.
Yeah, totally. It's a way of holding on to a piece of yourself even when everything else is changing.
Okay, so we talked about originally, which is about the past. Now, let's switch gears to a phrase that's all about, like, being super sure of something, that's for sure. Remember when the American speaker says Kansas is quieter and more peaceful? He adds, that's for sure.
Oh yeah, those little words make such a difference. It's not just stating a fact, it's like putting your stamp on it. I'm not just saying this, I really believe it.
You know, it makes me think about how we use language to show how confident we are about something, not just the information itself.
Totally. We're not just giving facts, we're showing our attitude, how we feel.
And isn't it interesting how that can be different in different cultures? What might sound like, just emphasizing a point here, might sound arrogant somewhere else.
Oh, absolutely. Which brings us back to that cultural awareness thing, right? Especially with small talk, it can be a minefield.
Yeah, all those unspoken rules. The podcast talked about topics to avoid in America, like salary, religion, how much things cost.
Right. And that can be super confusing for people from other cultures. Like in some places, asking about someone's income is a way of showing respect, that you're interested.
You know, I actually had that happen to me. I was traveling in Southeast Asia, and people talked about money so openly. At first, it felt kind of nosy, but then I realized it was just like their way of being friendly.
It's a perfect example of how our own background, our own culture, affects how we see things.
Yeah.
What feels like a private matter here might be totally normal somewhere else.
Makes you realize there's no one right way to communicate. You got to adapt, be aware of those little cues.
Exactly. And that's what makes talking to people from different cultures so interesting, so rewarding. You're always learning, adjusting your perspective.
So what other conversational, like, traps should we watch out for? Not just in America, but anywhere in the world.
Well, personal space is a big one. Some cultures, you stand really close when you're talking, right? But in others, that can feel aggressive, like you're in their face.
Oh, I've been in those situations. I'm a hugger, so I've had to learn that not everyone's, into that.
It's amazing how even without words, we can totally misunderstand each other. A hug, a pat on the back, it can mean completely different things depending on where you are.
It's crazy how these tiny differences can cause so much confusion or even, like, make people uncomfortable. What are some other nonverbal things that can be different?
Oh, eye contact is a huge one. Some places, looking someone directly in the eye is polite, shows you're paying attention. Other places, it can be seen as rude, like a challenge.
Interesting. I was always taught to make eye contact, but I can see how that could backfire in the wrong setting.
Totally. And then there's hand gestures, which are just like a whole other language. What's harmless here could be a huge insult somewhere else.
It's like a secret code you got to crack if you want to avoid making a mistake.
Exactly. And it's not just about avoiding mistakes. Understanding these differences helps you connect better, communicate more clearly.
So, how do you learn all this unspoken stuff? Can you read about it, or is it more about just experiencing it firsthand?
I think it's both. There's definitely books and stuff that can give you a head start, but the best way to learn is to just, immerse yourself, talk to people.
Get out there and experience it.
Exactly. Ask questions, watch how people interact, and don't worry about making mistakes. It's all part of the learning process.
It's all part of the fun.
Yeah. Which brings us back to what this whole deep dive is about, right?
Yeah.
Language is more than just words on a page. It reflects our culture, our values, how we see the world.
It's like a filter we see everything through.
Beautifully put. And as we continue with this language podcast, we'll keep digging deeper into how language shapes how we understand ourselves and the world around us.
Stay tuned for more linguistic adventures. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been really digging into this whole language learning thing.
But like we said, it's bigger than just memorizing words, right? For sure. It's like we're uncovering all these hidden rules about how people communicate, all this cultural stuff.
Yeah, it's like language is this mirror,
Yeah.
It shows you what people value, what they believe.
Okay, so before we were talking about all the nonverbal stuff, right? Like how body language can mean totally different things depending on where you are.
Right. Things like how close you stand, eye contact, all those hand gestures.
Yeah. And I was just thinking, what other subtle things might, trip us up when we're dealing with different cultures?
One thing that often catches people off guard is time.
Time. What do you mean?
Like in some cultures, time is super important.
Yeah.
Everything's scheduled. You got to be on time, no messing around.
Sounds familiar.
But other places, it's more relaxed. Showing up a little late, it's no big deal. Plans change. No one freaks out. It's just like a different flow.
So what's rude in one place might be totally normal somewhere else.
Exactly. And that can lead to like so much confusion, especially if you're working with people from different countries.
It really makes you realize that communication is like way more than just the words you say. It's about understanding what's going on beneath the surface, those cultural differences.
Totally. And the more we learn about that stuff, the better we'll be at, navigating this global world we live in.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are like the big takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think the main thing is go into any cross-cultural situation with curiosity and a little humility.
Humility. What do you mean?
Like realizing that our way of doing things isn't the only way or even necessarily the best way.
Being open to other people's perspectives, willing to learn.
Yeah, exactly. It's about stepping outside your comfort zone and embracing all the different ways of being in the world.
I like that. And that's a lesson that applies to like so much more than just language, right? Our relationships, our work, everything.
Totally. Because when you get down to it, we're all just trying to, connect with each other, understand each other.
And language is one of the best tools we have for doing that.
Absolutely. So next time you're in a situation with someone from a different culture, don't be afraid to, dive in.
Be curious, be respectful, and be ready to learn.
Because all that diversity, all those different perspectives,
Yeah.
That's what makes life interesting, right?
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, we've come to the end of our deep dive.
Hope you enjoyed exploring the the hidden world of language and culture with us.
And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Keep the conversation going.
Yeah, hit us up on social media, share your experiences. We're always learning too.
Until next time, keep diving deep and keep those conversations flowing.